Probably going to give it 1 or 2 minutes just to let a few more people log on, and then we'll start at about 2 minutes past, regardless of numbers. Thank you. Kick off. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name is Steve Nichols. I lead the mitigation team at the Presidential Climate Commission. Today's dialogue forms part of a series of dialogues we've been hosting on power and energy transitions, with the first two looking at the grid and transmission infrastructure and the energy mix that would comply with a net zero future. The next two looking at power at finance and pricing and industry structure. And so this is now the fifth, probably the most important topic of the dialogue, looking at just transitions, jobs and skills. So we're really happy that you're able to join us, and we have a really excellent lineup, and looking forward to getting your feedback. As usual, there's plenty of time for chat and discussion. We encourage you to please use the Q&A to ask questions, and we will try to respond to those questions as much as we can during the event. And those that aren't will be answered at a later point. So without much ado from me, I'm going to hand over to Brian Mantlana, the commissioner who's facilitating the session. So thanks very much, Dr. Mantlana.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. As Steve has said, my name is Brian Mantlana. I work at the CSIR. I lead the work of climate change at the CSIR. I am looking forward to this afternoon's conversation and discussion, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to first start with you, Steve, and invite you to give us the framework, the just transition framework that most of us at least know about. So let me start with you, and then after that I'll talk about the rest of the program. I see it's already screened. Perhaps let me start with it because I see that it's already up there on the screen. Just clearing up my screen here. So I'm going to ask Steve to speak about the just transition framework. After that, I'm going to ask Mohammed Patel to talk about the opportunities and challenges of the just transition. Then we're going to have an exchange based largely on those two inputs. And then we're going to have Thomas Mnguni, and then we have Lebum Laisi, Kwezi Mabasa, speaking on various, representing various views, community perspective, labor perspective, academics perspective, respectively. But the main part for me, the main issue is the exchange that we're going to have after those inputs. So I'm looking forward to an engaging conversation after hearing from those various inputs. Let's start with you, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I guess we felt it might be useful to just share very briefly the PCC perspective on a just transition, particularly because we've recently released the just transition framework, and that has now been approved by Cabinet. And so we're really excited about this because the principles and the sort of framing of the just transition that exists in that document is now something that we hope to mainstream. And when this was presented to the president who chairs the commission, his view was, this is a great piece of work, let's get on with implementation. And so now that's the challenge we face, is how do we go about actually achieving a just transition? So my presentation is really split into two parts, a little bit of a theoretical framing around jobs and skills and what the models are showing, and then diving a bit deeper into the transition framework and the kinds of principles and challenges that we face. I think that it is fair to say that we are all learning in this just transition space, and no one really has all of the answers yet. And certainly in the conversations that we've had with other countries around setting up similar just energy partnerships, just transaction partnerships as we have in South Africa, you know, everybody is kind of looking to South Africa to start solving some of these early problems. And so it's both a great responsibility, but also an enormous opportunity. So a lot of the models are showing a net increase in jobs from the energy transition, and we see this across other sectors as well. And so this is work that the NBI did, looking at more jobs are created in renewable energy construction and maintenance than would be lost in the phase out of coal. And we see this across a range of studies. So this is a study that the CSR did called the co-benefit study, also showing a net gain in jobs over time. However, we do see that in specific sectors and specific geographies, there may not be a positive gain. And so understanding those nuances and creating new opportunities, but also looking after those that have negative impacts from climate change is a big part of how we need to think about this problem. So both the models that the ESRG at GCT run, as well as the NBI BCG models, show a distinct drop in coal consumption and production over time. And obviously that then has a big impact on the coal sector specifically. But there are also other sectors that are impacted. So petrochemicals also shutting down in both models. And so these obviously create specific jobs and skills pressures for very specific communities. And we see that in more detail. So there, there's several 100,000, nearly up to 1 million jobs that are at risk in this transition from electricity, petrochemicals, mining, but also other sectors. And these jobs are particularly in the power sector, quite geographically located. And so most of the employment in coal mining is in Mpumalanga. Most of the employment in platinum mining is in the northwest, and so you have these kinds of pressures on specific areas as specific sectors change. And also being shown by numerous studies. So again, the co-benefit study concluding that there's a net gain nationally, but in Mpumalanga you might have a specific loss of jobs in the power sector. But also that those jobs are not necessarily comparable, and that's something that we need to also think about. This is recent analysis done by the University of Pretoria, also showing the impact of a range of scenarios on provinces. And so this is a change in the energy mix and how it impacts specific provinces. And you can see, some components of the economy, like exporting, increase, but a lot of there are a lot of negative impacts, but most notably in Mpumalanga. So the sort of diamond here is in Mpumalanga. So that's part of the rationale why we have such a focus on Mpumalanga. But thinking about this is really just looking at the power sector. So it's the predominant impact of coal. And if you were to do these kinds of charts for other sectors like automotive, for example, you would see impacts in other provinces like KZN and the Eastern Cape. But really just a kind of theoretical framing to say a lot of studies are showing that net jobs across the country will increase, but that there are specific sector and geographic impacts. And a lot of the just transition is about using the tools that we have to help protect and support workers and communities in those heavily impacted areas. And there are some areas that will grow, so it's also worth thinking about that. So this is some work that the UCT did and supported the World Bank, and you can see that some sectors actually do quite well in the transition, and some sectors do less well, quite often in the same geographies. And so you have a migration of work from one sector to another, and obviously that has huge implications for skills development and retraining. And so we have to think about the labor force again. This is work that the NBI did. We have a current employed labor force that do a particular type of work. Some of that work is permanent, some of it is temporary, some of it is highly skilled, some of it has lower skills, different levels of wages, levels of earnings. And what we want to be able to do is think about and plan for a labor force of the future that has more of the types of work that we want. So we obviously want better quality work, better paid work, more permanent work. And so the transition is an opportunity for us to think carefully about how we do that and the kinds of enablers that we might need to deploy in order to get there. And I'm sure that many of the speakers today will talk about some of these practical measures. And also what we want to be able to do is have more people employed. So the future labor force will hopefully have less unemployed and less people outside the labor force, in particular discouraged workers. So that's kind of where the Just Transition Framework comes in. So we acknowledge that context, and through a very long stakeholder engagement process, it could always be longer, but we tried to be as inclusive as possible. We kind of came up with this framework that does a couple of things. It tries to equitably distribute risks and responsibilities across society, particularly in the context of historical liability for the climate catastrophe. And that applies both locally and also internationally. We tried, as I say, to adopt this inclusive approach, and the outputs need to actively support workers and communities, particularly those affected by the transition. And really what we have been thinking carefully about is the opportunity that this creates for transitioning the economy as a whole. And so we have high levels of structural poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And the Just Transition is actually an opportunity to do more than just create parity. So we want to go beyond the logic that we hear sometimes that, well, we need to get to the same amount of jobs that we have now as we transition out of coal into something new. Actually, we need to address the underlying problems that exist in the economy and go beyond just this kind of parity logic. So we need to solve these deeply structural unemployment problems in particular. And the Mpumalanga and Eastern Cape, again, come up as key areas, given that they have higher than average unemployment, poverty, and inequality out of all of the provinces. So a couple of things to keep in mind, and I'm sure many of you know this, I'm rushing through it. The framework talks about three broad principles for just transition, and this is not work that we did, but from the literature: distributive justice, restorative justice, and procedural justice. And so the things that we do in order to drive a transition need to address all three of these. Procedural justice is about involving people in decision making. And so the phrases we hear most often in the consultations is no decisions about us without us, the implication that you need to involve particularly people who are impacted in these conversations. And then, of course, no one left behind. And so these procedural justice issues are important. How do we work with all of the stakeholders in those communities, particularly those that are often excluded? Distributive justice, making sure that the benefits of any investment made actually accrue to people in the communities and workers in the communities around which the project is based. And then restorative justice is using the opportunity of these investments to rectify historical injustice. And so issues of social ownership and land in particular become dominant themes in that space. This is again some work that the NBI did, and I think it's useful just to look at this bottom row. to say that when we think about a just transition, we often think about jobs and skills, but that's not all that there is in a just transition. So we also need to be thinking about social welfare and ecological welfare. We need to think about managing geographic and cultural dislocation, impacts on migrant communities. We need to be thinking about education in the longer term, as well as shorter term capacitation and skilling. Economic inclusion and participation is key, particularly for vulnerable groups. Ownership is the one that I'm most curious about, and something we're very passionate about here at the PCC, but we need a long dialogue on how we solve some of these ownership challenges. Quality of work, obviously important. Infrastructure planning and rollout, particularly important in some of the mining areas where the mines have taken on responsibility for managing municipal infrastructure. And so if that mine were to close down, you have the double whammy of both the loss in jobs and GDP, but also then an additional bonus on local bonus burden on municipalities to look after this infrastructure. And then, of course, policy and governance and how we interact is really key. So as I mentioned, we've done a lot of stakeholder engagement, and these are some of the things that are raised by communities. And my sort of personal assessment of these community engagements, and look forward to the comments of others, is that communities and workers are generally very well informed about climate change, the potential impacts of climate change, and the need to transition away from fossil fuels. Where there's a lot of uncertainty and angst is in the short term in relation to service delivery and continued employment, but in the longer term in relation to climate change, a lot of uncertainty about the timing and then what's next. And so we're effectively asking people to take known short-term risks in lieu of uncertain long-term gains. And so we need to do a lot of work, I think, helping communities and workers have much more accurate data and timelines, but also having a say in what those future investments and future work opportunities might look like, but making sure that we actually start investing in these spaces to build confidence. So there are a couple of things that the framework then talks about. It talks about working on active labor market interventions, reskilling, retraining, and I'm sure that Lebogang will have much to say about this. Industrial policy, how do we think about economic diversification? What other opportunities do we create in relation to getting the best out of the mines that we have, in relation to transitioning to new green opportunities, but also into opportunities that may not be green. I mean, they're neutral, but they help create jobs and build livelihoods and support communities in those areas. And then, of course, social support. So it is unfortunately probably unrealistic that every employable person in these regions will be able to get work. We will obviously try to maximize that, but there also needs to be other social support, therefore, for those who are unable to work, but also generally access to healthcare services, service delivery, and so on. So those are three key areas, but then also governance is important, how we work with local communities, how we integrate into government planning, how we integrate into business planning, and how we work with the initiatives already underway, for example, the Green Cluster in Mpumalanga. And then obviously finance is key, and we as the PCC have already started talking to incubator funds and philanthropy to start thinking about, once we generate a pipeline of opportunities in these areas, and TIPS have done a lot of work on this, how do we start getting the ball rolling and actually get early wins? So we need to start, creating jobs and improving livelihoods now, not in 2030 or 2045, and obviously ongoing until those times. But finance and the role of the private sector and how state money can be used to stimulate additional investment is a very important topic in the just transition. There are a number of ideas that are already starting to emerge from various studies. These are things that have come out of the co-benefits report. I'm sure that Mohammed is going to talk a lot more about some of the work that the TIPS have done and specific opportunities they've identified. And then finally, just to look at some of the work that we at the PCC are going to be doing over the next 2 to 3 years, working in areas like Mpumalanga and the Eastern Cape. is using our economic modeling capability, ours meaning the nations, not necessarily the PCCs, to start forecasting what kinds of sectors will do well, what kind of sectors might not do well. And so we have these net zero pathways that help us think about future and current industry. And then we want to run a whole bunch of bottom-up processes with communities, with workers, to identify diversification opportunities and start to build that pipeline of investable opportunity and job creating opportunity. We'll need to do a lot of data gathering and support. As I say, there's a lot of gaps in the models. When we say that national jobs will be created, we're not necessarily comparing like to like jobs. So a job that's lost in the mining sector isn't necessarily the same as a job that's created in the construction sector. And so we need a lot more granular data on how we think about jobs forecasting. So we'll do a lot of work on regionalizing economic models, that we have much more local views of some of the impacts and shocks. And we can use these three things to start thinking about the future of the workforce. And obviously the whole time engaging with communities, workers, and other stakeholders. This jobs forecasting will also give us an opportunity to think about skills forecasting. What kind of skills do we need in the future? Who do we need to work with in the skills ecosystem? And then, of course, the final piece of the puzzle, looking at social policy. So this is the kind of broad work areas we're thinking about, but as I say, we're still learning alongside everybody else. And so this dialogue we're really excited about, because it's an opportunity to hear from you in the audience, hear from experts and specialists assembled as the speakers, and start to really work together on framing a just transition in South Africa. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take questions a bit later on, but also we're here to hear from all of you. So thanks very much, and I'll hand back to you, Brian.
Thanks, Steve. You've done well to give that talk of a very detailed document in such a short period of time. So thank you. I'm going to ask Mohammed Patel to come in. Mohammed is at TIPS, and please take the floor, Mohammed.
Thanks so much, Brian, and good afternoon to everyone that's joining here today. My name is Mohammed Patel. I'm a senior economist at TIPS, which stands for Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. We're a policy research organization based in Pretoria, and we focus on industrial policy and sustainable growth topics and issues. We've been involved with the just transition for some time now, and in this presentation, I just want to give a kind of overall framing of some of the opportunities and challenges that we see emerging in the just transition, with a focus on energy, since that's the topic of today. So this is just basic context and framing, and it's very basic stuff, so I'm not going to spend too much of time on it. But we know that the climate crisis is real, and it's driven a lot of policy changes and dynamics throughout the world, with regards to embarking on mitigation and adaptation within various energy value chains. And markets have begun to transform. And in this transformation, the just transition has been elevated as a priority. Some of the key principles, which Steve already mentioned, there's a clear justice lens, and we talk about participatory, distributive, and restorative justice. And there's a key focus on inclusivity and adopting a sort of bottom-up approach, where impacted stakeholders, such as workers, small businesses, and communities, are given agency in the sort of planning process, as well as figuring out what the potential solutions are as we migrate away from fossil-based energy systems towards lower carbon and sustainable energy systems. As has been mentioned, it's quite a complex transition. There's lots of moving parts. There's lots of overlaps between different value chains, different developmental issues, etc. And we don't have all the answers yet, but there are certainly a number of developments that are going on within the country. So just a brief recap of how this has been unraveling. In 2019, we were part of something known as the SJRP or NEVA process, which was a vulnerability assessment and to start beginning planning for the just transition in South Africa. The analysis involved an assessment of 5 value chains at the time. So the most obvious one was the coal value chain. It also included agriculture, tourism, petrol-based transport, and metals mining. Since then, there have been a number of encouraging developments. I can't cover every single development, but I'm covering the main ones here. So the PCC was set up as well as the PCF TTs, the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, to try to basically coordinate the various just transition initiatives that are happening throughout the country, unify them, and plan in the short, medium, and long term in order to get this right. We do obviously face a number of challenges, some of which are not within our control. So there's international dynamics at play as well, but these sort of institutions are really key in order to successfully transition and prioritize the justice element. There's also been responses by various stakeholders throughout the country. Steve's mentioned the NBI pathways work, the decarbonization pathways work that's been done. Mining firms are sort of allocating resources around investments in renewable energy. There's some linkages as well, given our platinum resources towards the green hydrogen value chain and sort of absorbing just transition elements into the development of this value chain as we move forward. Encouragingly, South Africa has a Hydrogen Society roadmap, and there's developments around the hydrogen corridors throughout the country as well, which are incorporating just transition elements as well and are linked to energy value chains. There's also been a number of responses by other stakeholders like workers and labor unions. COSATU has been part of the just transition, advocating for the just transition narrative for some time now. There's early work around the climate change framework in 2011. We know there's the COSATU just transition blueprint as well. That was released recently. Civil society and communities as well. There's the Life After Coal campaign. Groundwork as well has been involved in a number of community-based initiatives with a specific focus on some of the local municipalities in Mpumalanga, so where the coal fields lie, like Emalahleni and Stishwete. And there's also been a response from government departments, like provincial departments, looking at recovery plans and absorbing just transition elements into strategic plans for the province and some of the local municipalities. So, I mean, to understand energy, and as Steve had on the initial on his initial presentation, a key part of this energy story is the story of Mpumalanga, and a lot of our work has focused there as well in terms of trying to understand the context, the vulnerabilities, and as well as the needs of local stakeholders to really prioritize the bottom-up approach. Just for some context, we know that some of the local municipalities in Mpumalanga are highly reliant on the coal value chain. And this is not unlike other coal regions throughout the world where we have these mono economies that highly rely on coal, and all of the allied services like retail services, accommodation, etc., are linked to the coal value chain, and their successes rely on the success of the coal value chain. So here we see that certain municipalities like Emalahleni and Stishwete, high reliance on the coal value chain with some manufacturing, and the reliance on coal is much higher as compared to the rest of the country. When we look at the employment data as well, this sort of mirrors the GVA figures. Mpumalanga does have some key assets that it has to draw on when we think about coal transition. It has key access to important markets. There's the Maputo Development Corridor. It's linked to Gauteng. It's also linked to some of the ports via the existing rail infrastructure that Transnet operates. There's also a lot of generation and transmission infrastructure. So we know almost all of the coal power stations are located within Mpumalanga. So there's that infrastructure which can be repurposed once the coal power stations are decommissioned. There's also access to the transmission grid. So if we think about investments into renewable energy, for example, we can easily tap into the national transmission infrastructure in order for Mpumalanga to somewhat retain its reputation as the energy center of the country. There's also land availability, and historically there's been competition for land between other economic activities like agriculture, for example. So historically we do have issues where mining land competes with agricultural land and arable land, but there is still a lot of arable land that can be harnessed for growing certain types of crops that are already growing within Mpumalanga, like maize and soya. There's also a young and dynamic population. So more than 92%, according to statistics data, of the population are below the age of 60. So these are some of the key assets within the energy heartland of the country that can be used as a base in order to plan a future away from coal and reduce coal intensity. Given the assets, there are some key challenges that emerge when we think about transitioning. Firstly, the high orientation towards coal. So a lot of the towns have been developed around the mines and the power stations. And as I mentioned just now, a lot of the allied economic activities linked to the coal value chain, and their success and profitability depend on the success and the profitability of the coal value chain. So once the mines start to reduce in output and profitability, and once the power stations shut down, other allied economic activities start to decline. So that's a key risk that needs to be worked around. Mpumalanga also has a high degree of in-migration, where people move into the province to try and seek better fortunes, and as a result, places a burden on an existingly strained service delivery landscape. Informal settlements are also a constraint on local resources. There's two other impacts that come as a result of coal mining and coal use. So mining has a very clear impact on households and communities. When mines blast, for example, this has an impact on some of the existing structures of households and other small businesses. There's also decades of damage from historical coal use that results in air pollution and impacts on population health. So I'm just going to run through some of the opportunities that we've come across through our work around the just transition and in the region. I can't cover all of them in extreme detail, but I will place links in my presentation to some of the reports where we have more detail on some of these opportunities. So the first and obvious opportunity is within energy, and there's certainly an opportunity for renewable energy solutions within Mpumalanga, especially given access to the transmission grid, and given the fact that in other places of the country where renewables conditions are better, like in the Western Cape and Northern Cape, a lot of the transmission capacity is almost saturated. So it represents an opportunity for economic diversification away from coal, as well as increased job uptake, as Steve mentioned in the early presentation around some of the modeling and where the employment opportunities lie. So some of the key players within the energy value chains, like Eskom and Sasol, are exploring renewable energy solutions within the region. Sasol, in addition, is also exploring green hydrogen options within its operations. So there is the potential there for job absorption from displaced workers from the coal value chain into some of these potential value chains. With the president's announcement around some of the exemptions around the renewable energy caps, we're likely to see increased investments around renewable energy there as well. There's also opportunities within logistics. So coal truckers in the SJRP NEVA work, coal truckers were identified as a key vulnerable group, especially the smaller coal truckers, a lot of them black owned, that only transport coal between the power stations and the mines. So here there are opportunities that arise, and this is based off work that we did with colleagues from WWF for the transport, or for the conversion of coal truckers to transport of biomass that's used in producing sustainable aviation fuel, for example. So we know that Sasol is piloting the production of sustainable aviation fuel in Secunda in a consortium, and there's a potential for those truckers to migrate towards the transport of biomass. So there's an economic opportunity there for repurposing. There's also opportunities around the utilization of mining land for biomass production and food production. An important element that we've been looking at throughout assessing economic opportunities is local government capacity. So if you recall, Steve presented some of the elements in the framework. One of them was good governance. And especially when we think about the bottom-up approach, local government is the face of government on the ground. And it's the face of government that interacts with communities and interacts with local businesses and workers. And it's really important for local municipalities to have the resources and capacity to in actually contributing toward the transition and being embedded in some of the solutions as well. So here there's also the role for municipalities to develop skills in the maintenance and repair of renewable generation infrastructure, to set up pilot programs. The SAREM also identifies the potential for the localized manufacturing of some renewable energy components as well, and allied services. So there's also opportunities there for workers to get involved, and for local government skills to be improved as well. Another opportunity is manufacturing. So historically, manufacturing activities have been confined to the energy intensive value chains. But there are opportunities around low carbon and sustainable options that manifest in some of these value chains. So the metals value chains, for example, we know that there's Columbus steel, and with migration towards green steel and the use of green hydrogen, with increased demand for green steel, makes the investments around green hydrogen and green steel manufacture attractive within the region. So that's one opportunity for uptake within Mpumalanga. There's also opportunities around minerals processing. So there's vanadium reserves, and there's the potential for beneficiation into vanadium batteries. There's also manganese resources, and that can be beneficiated for use in a number of applications, like lithium-ion battery production that can be used in storage. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there's also opportunities for renewable energy components manufacturing. So the SAREM has identified some key components like cables, balance of system, mounting structures, turbine hubs, inverters, etc. And these can be used to, the demand for these types of renewable energy inputs can be used as a business case to start production of some of these components. Another opportunity is coal ash beneficiation, but this has to be couched in the reality that it's linked to the production or to the burning of coal. So as long as you're burning coal, you have ash that's produced, and this ash can be beneficiated if one takes a circular economy approach. But the timelines around this are important to understand. So because it's linked to coal use, the investment case needs to be proven. But in other countries like India, for example, there are projects where coal ash is used to produce goods like cement or bricks, which can then be used in social housing programs, for example, or community programs to build a school or clinic or something along those lines, and can be used to benefit the local economy. We do know that Sasol and Eskom, it costs them money to store this ash, so it's also a business opportunity for them to sell the ash as well. But this needs to be obviously approached with caution, given the timelines and given that coal is likely to decline in use over time. An important area for economic diversification is mining rehabilitation. Unfortunately, South Africa has quite a bad reputation around rehabilitating mines and repurposing them for use according to the legislation and the regulations around how it's supposed to work. We have a high incidence of abandoned mines or mines being sold off without the proper rehabilitation being done. So this is a key opportunity in order to remediate the land that's been used by mining, and to use the assets for other types of economic activities. So there's a potential to rehabilitate mining land and use it for agriculture, either to produce food or if the soil is not safe enough, then to produce biomass, for example, which can be used in other economic opportunities like sustainable aviation fuel, for example. Agriculture is another one, and it's an important one since Mpumalanga already produces some key South African crops like macadamia nuts, avocados, maize, and soybeans. There certainly is a case. BFAP, for example, forecasts rising demands for some of these agricultural products over the period 2020 to 2029. There's also other market opportunities within the region. So given the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that sees the removal of some tariffs for a lot of food and agricultural goods on the continent, there's also an export opportunity there for agriculture grown within Mpumalanga to be exported within the region at prices that are more competitive than other regions out of the continent. As I said, local government is an important part of this story, and skills, and thinking about skills and enhancing skills within the local government context is also an important factor to take into account. A lot of the time when we talk about transition, the focus gets placed on displaced workers and communities, but an often neglected part is local government. And a lot of our work has also been trying to explore some of these dynamics around local governments, their capacity, and what is required. So we do know that local governments have to have the responsibility of putting together IDPs and local economic development plans. And increasingly, there's a need for local governments to absorb just transition type thinking and economic diversification thinking into their LEDs and IDPs. So the thinking is moving towards thinking about a future away from coal, and what are the skills that are required in the next 5-10 years within municipalities to cater to how these local economies are going to diversify. So in that assessment, we see a clear need for a lot of skills within local governments as well. So skills around maintenance and engineering related to wind and solar, technicians, fuel cell and electrolyzer mechanics. There's also skills that are required within construction management. If we think about there are already existing green building standards, for example, that assess construction, how it can be done in the most lowest carbon and sustainable ways possible. There's certainly a need for that within municipalities. There's the obvious need around water and environmental management. We know in Mpumalanga, there's key issues around water contamination, acid mine drainage. So it's looking around how this water can be rendered to a potable standard, for example, the use of next generation sanitation type technologies as well. So that's kind of the brief overview and framing. I obviously can't do justice to everything, but I just want to conclude with a few remarks. So the first is that there's no template for transitions. There's no cookie cutter approach. Every country, every region, every municipality is going to have to look at its resources and try and figure out the best way forward in terms of 10, 20, 30 years from now when coal is likely to not be around. Diversification is an important tool. It's one tool in the basket of tools that we have for thinking about the just transition, but it certainly is an important one and needs to align with other types of tools like reskilling, retraining, social support, etc., and good governance. There's a number of economic opportunities that present themselves for the Mpumalanga region. We kind of have a sense of where they are for now, but there's certainly likely to be other opportunities that rise in the course of understanding the region. But it's certainly going to take a coordinated approach. So there needs to be strong links between the different tiers of government, so national, provincial, local, as well as coordination between the state and all of the other impacted stakeholders like workers, like communities, etc. I'm sure we're going to hear some interesting discussion from some of our other stakeholder representatives that are here today. But that's it for me from the framing point of view. I just want to provide some links here to two policy briefs that we did. So one was around economic diversification, specifically focusing on Emma Schleni and Steve Shwete, the two most coal-intensive local economies in the country, as well as the local government toolbox. So, you know, what local governments can do and in terms of their mandates and where they fit in the transition. I also would like to say that we are going to release two other policy briefs quite soon. One is on the participatory justice elements, already disentangling participatory justice, the history in South Africa and how it fits in with the just transition, as well as looking at how some of the local municipalities and the province can get involved with renewable energy, especially given the president's announcements around the electricity crisis. Thanks so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks for that presentation. I've noted that in the chats there were a number of responses, or questions or comments. I just want to perhaps start by opening the floor for any comments or questions for Mohammed and for Steve. And then I'll squeeze in time for some of the comments that have been written down. Can you raise your hand? Let me see if I can see the hands. I do not see any hand at the moment. Can I ask Hlengi Zondo Kabini wrote a message, or I see a hand from Etienne. Let's start with Hlengi Zondo. She raised a question, a comment about the communication aspect of the JT process. And I think perhaps it's an aspect that is one of those underrepresented in our advancing of this concept. So Hlengi Zondo, if you can hear me, can you come in, please? I do not see.
Yes. Sorry, can you hear me, Brian?
Yes, I can. Please continue, sis.
Yes, so for me, the communication aspect is very crucial. We all know that the climate crisis is real, but how can we communicate this time around such that the communication is completely different? It's completely different, and I'll tell you why. Previously, our government have either missed key deadlines on some of the projects that they were doing, or some of the projects just failed because there was no resolution to make sure that these projects are successful. I could give an example about the broadband digital migration. We're long supposed to have completed the broadband digital migration. To this day, the BDM project has not been done, has not been completed. I could think of our own plans which are contained in the National Development Plan, your 2030 horizon. We can think about government leasing unused buildings, customers not billed by water trading entities. So there is a plethora of experience that we've heard where the state has just not been able to start something and finish an item in time. And I'm just worried that somehow the comms needs to be differently. Somehow, whether you do a pilot or however you communicate, it should be clear that this time around, it's not business as usual. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy. Thanks for raising that. Let's move to Etienne, and then after Etienne, it's going to be Honor 10 Light. Etienne?
Thanks, Brian. It's regarding the question I put in the chat. The developed countries have promised $8.5 billion to help with the transition. And that was in November last year. And until now, not $1 has flown. And my concern is the developed world is just playing lip service, and they've got no intention, or not intention, but it's really a PR exercise. Because what should have happened is the day after they promised the money, they should have sent the money to us with provided we give the undertaking that 100% of the money will be spent on the transmission grid, retraining of communities, and renewable energy projects. Now, just those three projects will be a lot more than 8.5 billion that we need to spend. So, I mean, what more do developed countries want? I mean, if we can undertake that it's going to be used in those 3 or 4 projects, I mean, what's delaying the flow of the funds? I mean, during this time, we're emitting CO2, and that's a world problem. So I'm not sure if the PCC has a view on that.
Yeah, that's clear. That's clear, Etienne. I'm tempted to comment on that, but I'm not. But you make a point there. I think your point is about the agency. Yes. And the misalignment between agency and action. I would stop short of underplaying the commitment, but that's a personal view. But I hear your point. Your point is about agency and the need to do something by yesterday. So I get your point. Let's move to Honor 10 Light, and then after that to Lindy Nzwana. Honor 10 Light.
Okay, hi, sir. I'm Honor 10 Light, Zodwa Ranyadi. I don't know why my name is not, this technology. I'm sorry about that. My question, I will relate it to Mohammed. In his presentation, he talked about a lot of opportunities, and I just tend to grab the one which it talks about mining rehabilitation. So my question would be, who's going to do the rehabilitation? Is it the owners who left the mines unattended, or is it the government, or is it the municipalities where these mines are based now? And how are they going to do that? And what is the time frame of doing that, especially to the mines that are no longer working? Because really, we are tired of this also zamazamas of what is happening in our country. I wish I can be clear on that. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Sodo. Now it's corrected. 10 Light has disappeared. Zodwa is appearing. Thanks for the question. I'll give Mohammed a chance to answer, to respond. But let's first have Lindy Nzwana. Come in, please, Lindy.
Okay, thank you. My name is Lindy Nzwana from Grassroots for Climate Action. We are a group that has been following the PCC a lot, and we are doing that. But my question is about job opportunities that are there in terms of, just transition, because we talked about reskilling and repurposing. So my concern is, where are the women are going to fit in this reskilling? Because most of the times you'll find that men are always on the forefront when it comes to skills. And when we talk about just transition jobs, we're talking about, rooftops and all that. Are women also going to be included in this skilling of job opportunities? Thank you.
Thank you, sis. I do not see any other hand, but I think we've got time for just one more question. Perhaps if I can bring in Mike Mueller. Mike Mueller wrote a question about the geospatial aspects challenging the notion of perhaps over-focusing in Mpumalanga. Mike Mueller, can you hear us? Please come in. I see your hand, Mabelo. Let's start with Mike Mueller. Can you hear me, Mike? Looks like Mike is not hearing me. Okay, let's move then to Moabelo Nzima.
I think Mike should be able to answer that as well.
Moabelo Nzimande.
Good day. Thank you for the opportunity for the question. I represent an organization called Grassroots for Climate Action, which is working in partnership with EarthLife Africa. My question is around the investors into renewable energy. I once read that Black participants or African participants have been capped to 30%. And there's also the question that says, developed countries aren't coming to the ball in terms of giving the money. And when I'm looking at the war in Ukraine and the current energy crisis around the world and the recession, and I'm questioning that I believe we're going to wait longer for this money. So as a solution in terms of creating opportunities and also expanding the landscape for Black participation in renewable energy, how about government invest in the recycling of renewable energy project component parts, such as solar panels? We see with other countries around the world which have implemented renewable energy, they are starting to invest immensely in the recycling of renewable energy component pieces. So I'm just suggesting, Guti, okay, to seeing that we have been capped, how about to expand our opportunity? We invest in the recycling of renewable energy component parts. Thanks. Can you comment on that?
Thanks, Mr. Nzimande. Let me give the chance to to Mohammed to respond to some of the comments that he has had. Please come in, Mohammed.
Yeah, sure. On the mining closure, my understanding is that mining firms have to set aside funds, rehabilitation funds. And then once the rehabilitation process is meant to be an inclusive one where there's proper engagement with communities around assessing what their needs are, wide stakeholder engagement, and then making an informed decision around how the mine is supposed to be rehabilitated and what the land is meant to be used for. So that's a brief around the mining rehabilitation issue. But it's meant to be inclusive, and it's meant to be ultimately the land needs to be brought to its original condition, if not even better, and should then be in a condition such that it can be used as an asset for the local economy.
Thanks, Mohammed. I take it that you're not going to respond to all the comments that were made, but I'm looking.
Sorry, I may have missed that. Sorry, I may have missed the other question. What was the other question?
Well, one of the questions was around the issue of rehabilitation, and also the opportunities for broad participation in the in the aspect of renewable energy materials, in manufacturing thereof. So there was that aspect that came through. Also, there was also the gender question by Lindin Zwana. It was not a question, it was just seeking assurances of where do we find assurances that there will be, the gender aspects are taken seriously in our thinking and framing and conceptualization and actions on just transition.
Yeah, no, so I fully support the idea that vulnerable stakeholders or should be included in solutions. So there's a big drive for examining, for example, within renewable energy, social ownership models that see partial ownership of infrastructure by workers and communities, and the different types of business models around that. There certainly is an important area of research within the just transition discourse. I fully support exploring those different types of business models, especially when you think about having an inclusive ownership approach. Yeah.
Thanks. Louise, I see your hand. I request we proceed. Please note down your input. We're going to have another round of inputs. I want to invite Thomas Ngoni to come in now. Thomas, can you hear me? Are you ready to make your input? Please come in.
Thanks. Chair, thanks for the opportunity. And I think, Chair, just to let everybody know, I didn't prepare a presentation, and solely because I believe this discussion has been going on for quite some time now.
Thomas, you're not coming through. You're not coming through clearly on my side.
And the key is it better? Hello?
Yes, proceed.
Okay. So I think just on the first issue around procedural justice, I don't think we will be in a position to capitalize on any opportunity for as long as, one, we want to engage with people, but we are not transparent enough. I think this has been a call that information needs to be in the public domain. We need to make sure that we hold this, and we also make sure that we hold access. So our assumption, people are in a position to connect online, yet we know that as much as we might live in urban areas, let alone people living in rural areas, we still have challenges in terms of internet or online communication. And we continue holding these sessions online with the false assumption that people will be engaging. So for me, I think the whole principle of making sure that this process inclusive does not reflect the situation because we are leaving a lot of people out. Talk about the second aspect. I'm not going to talk a lot about restoration. It's a key to our discussions. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the decommissioning of Komati, the closure of Frontflay. But what we haven't addressed is how do we ensure the welfare of the workers, the welfare of the communities around Steve Chwete, what we say about the health of the people who been for years impacted by the pollution coming out of either the coal mine or the power station that they lived around. We haven't even said a word about that. We haven't said a word about how we're going
Thomas,
to
can you hear me?
the water that
Thomas, can you hear me?
Holding a seminar of this nature being involved. And moving to RE, talking about getting, yes? Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I was just checking. We are struggling to hear you. I think your second point was around the welfare of workers and communities. I just want to check, is it possible that we give you time to sort yourself and we give another speaker to come in and then you come later? Would that help you? Or you want to continue?
That's fine. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
So let me give you some time to sort yourself better, and then I'm going to ask Lebo to speak now. Then after Lebo, I'm going to come back to you, Thomas, and you may start on your second point, and you pick it up from there. I apologize for this. Lebo, I see you ready. Please come in, my sister.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the PCC for organizing this session. I'm just going to be talking on an issue around rethinking.
Sorry, Lebo, please introduce yourself.
Sorry about that. My name is Lebogang Molaisi. I'm the head of policy for COSATU. I'm also a commissioner for the Presidential Climate Commission, and I'll just be providing some reflections and some perspectives from Labour. I thought it would be important. I decided not to share my presentation, so I'll just speak to it. Maybe that'll also help the process of engagement a bit. I figured we should talk about the issue of, rethinking the concept of, collective bargaining. I think in COSATU's conceptual framing of the just transition, we understand that the transition must happen and it needs to be just. And we are also alive to the fact that within the transition, there will be disruptions, hence the need for there to be this element of justice within the transition. So with that said, I just wanted to reflect on just some ideas of how we need to rethink collective bargaining within the just transition to a low carbon economy, because we think this is one key industrial policy institution that is central for a transition to be just, and if made use correctly, can assist us to bring employers and workers together towards achieving a just transition to a low carbon economy. So just by ways of a brief introduction, I think, we've, and Steve, you've already made the points around this when you touched on the various elements and principles of the just transition framework. But what we deem as being quite critical for there to be, for us to resolve, especially on the decent work agenda, especially when we talk about the issue of jobs, is the centrality around collective bargaining and social dialogue being essential for decent work, industrial relations, stability, labor protection, and enhancing welfare benefits for workers. Steve talked to the point earlier about, if you're going to transition a worker from the mining sector into the construction sector, there are dynamics that need to be considered, especially if you want this transition to be just. It's not just the mobility of workers from one sector to another and assuming that you've solved a problem. It's actually more complex than that. And those are the complexities that we don't talk about in these discussions that can result in industrial relation instability moving forward. So the transition of workers to a low carbon economy will require strengthened collective bargaining institutions and social dialogue to ensure that particularly the at-risk workers materially benefit from a just transition. Now, there are ways in which we can do this, and we think that the basis has to be in law. We believe that labor market shifts in the just transition towards a low carbon economy necessitate coordination and integration between two legislative regimes, between environmental law, which prioritizes decarbonization. So this, for example, the climate change bill, as well as employment legislation, which prioritize labor standards and wages, which include the Labor Relations Act and the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. We think these two could work together as a basis for us to begin the process of transition and to protect workers' rights. Industrial relations institutions have the institutional capacity to deconstruct the trade-offs between workers and the environment, empowering workers' capacity to respond to long-standing environmental standards. In our reflections, and I know the argument will be that South Africa is very unique, and I agree. We are a very unique country. We have a very unique set of circumstances, particularly in our labor market, but it's always good to reflect on what's been the experience in other parts of the world. One of the experiences that we did reflect on is particularly the Italian experience that we found to be quite interesting. So the experience provides a case study in which trade unions and employer associations have prioritized a decarbonization agenda with the incorporation of environmental sustainability and industrialization observed already in that country over the past 2 decades. And within this experience, what we've seen is a mixed bag of results across sectors, regions, firms, because of regional variables that are constrained over and above the policy positions of the unions as well as the employer association. So you could say that within South Africa as well, there are a number of variables that are different across regions as well as sectors that can also result in us seeing quite differences in terms of cases. In some cases, this has been successful with limited negative social impacts on workers and communities, while in others, the negative impact on jobs and communities have been significant. So it hasn't been the case where the experience in terms of having a just transition for particular industries and workers, it's not been the case that there's been successes consistently. There's been differences in whether there's been successes or failures in the transition to a low carbon economy. However, studies do tell us that where there has been successes, it can be attributed to the way in which communities, as well as trade union organization, participate in the process of decarbonization. And this has been identified as a key component in reducing adverse socioeconomic impacts of decarbonization. Participation has driven convergence of ideas as well as forces in particular sectors as well as industries. And this takes us back to the Just Transition Framework for South Africa that talks about the issue of procedural justice. This is going to be an important factor if we were to get the labor market question particularly right, and to also solve for the community question. But I don't want to try and speak on behalf of the community representatives here. what we've seen is that, labor market shifts previously in our previous experiences have not delivered desirable results. So it's no wonder that the labor market shifts as a result of the low carbon economy transition. There is a feeling that they could result in industrial relations conflict. And this is because the experience tells us that whenever there has been, structural change in our society, the labor market responses to these structural changes has been adverse for workers. So this has resulted in labor brokering, the subversion of the Labor Relations Act, and the minimization of trade union participation, increased casualization, short time work, as well as what we're now seeing as the non-conventional relationships between the employer and the employees. So this is always at the back of workers' mind, especially when we talk to the issue of structural change and the changes that could arise in our labor market as a result to a just transition, or could result as a transition to a low carbon economy. And this is why we should really bet and create a consensus position on the centrality of collective bargaining, because these are already established institutions that already enjoy representative from workers and employers associations. And we need to prioritize the decarbonization agenda within these particular institutions in order to drive a fair deal between employers as well as workers. But we have a problem. In the face of declining union density, how do we encourage more collective bargaining to take place if we agree indeed that this is a central principle? This can be done, and this can be done if we look at the principles of extending collective bargaining agreements to non-unionized workers, so that we can bring more and more workers into the collective bargaining sphere, whether they are part of a union or not. I'd like for them to be a part of a union, but that's a story for another day. But these things have happened previously, and they can happen via two different mechanisms. Previously, and I know in Europe they do this very well, the extension of collective bargaining has been done either through extending collective bargaining agreements to non-unionized workers in companies affiliated to employer organization association who are binded by a particular negotiating agreement. Or secondly, you can do this through a second approach, which would be to extend collective bargaining to non-affiliated companies. This is usually done through a declaration of general application and amendment to legislation. This we've done as a country. We've done this through the national minimum wage. This was done through amendment to legislation, and it applied to all employers. So this is another way in which we can extend collective bargaining to non-parties. So the extension of collective bargaining will ensure greater coverage of workers regardless of their type of employment or worker organization affiliation. However, collective bargaining in the just transition will only ensure that the needs of the employer, capital, and labor are taken care of. Other mechanisms must be explored to ensure a just transition for communities affected by a just transition to a low carbon economy. This is where the conversation around the UBIG becomes quite central. How do we incorporate the UBIG into our discussions around the just transition to a low carbon economy? Because this is one way in which we can sort out the question around the livelihoods of communities. With my last remaining minute, I do want to talk about the fact that in these discussions, we do not give enough attention to the question around women in the transition, as well as young people in the transition. So over and above workers and communities' needs that we treat as a periphery issue when we talk about financing and when we talk about the ability of industries to technically adapt to a low carbon economy, we don't necessarily talk enough about women in the transition as well as youths in the transition. We don't have concrete plans around this. This is some of the work that COSATU wants to do moving forward in order to create plans on how to deliberately force the agenda of expanding women's participation in youth in the just transition to a low carbon economy, because we see opportunities here, but if you don't plan for them accurately, they could definitely be left on the sideline again as we enter into another process of change in our economy. So briefly, those were the reflections from organized labor. Thank you.
Thanks, Lebo. Thanks for your input. Let me go back to Thomas. Thomas, please come back. If you can hear me, can you please connect again? Yes, I see.
I hope I won't have any network challenges now.
Continue.
Yeah. So I think just to continue, I think part of what I was mentioning earlier was the importance to understand the level of damage that was done by the mining sector and other fossil fuel industry sectors, especially on the people's health. Because as much as we're talking about how we move forward, I don't think we anticipate or understand the negative impact the sectors we're talking about had on people's health. And that needs to be dealt with, because I think Mohammed alluded to it earlier to say we still have a lot of labor migration happening. And if these people are going to be demobilized now or retrenched now, and they go back home, and then that means they're carrying the diseases from the Highveld back home, and they won't be getting any adequate healthcare in those areas. So in terms of restorative justice, we need to think about that. And we don't need to think about the just transition in the context of the coal fields only. We need to think about other areas where the people come from, because part of a just transition is to say, how do we then assist them to still earn a livelihood and live a healthy life, even if they go back home? So I think for me, that is important. Now, I think there are a couple of missed opportunities that we have seen, especially within the energy sector. I mean, we knew back in 2005, 2007, that from 2008, we will face load shedding, but we did nothing. We knew that in 2010, there will be problem with load shedding, but we did nothing. But I think right now, because we are all talking about how we phase out fossil fuels, I think this gives the MRE an honest opportunity to say, now I need to stop issuing mining rights and mining licenses so that I could begin a process where we build our economy in a different way. We need to stop the competition for land between a coal mine and an agricultural sector. So we need to produce food in order for us to deal with food security in the country, not have competition between coal and food. So I think this should be one of the opportunities. We say DMRE needs to come on board and stop issuing mining licenses so that when we phase out coal, we are not left with stranded assets, wherein now we will see industry going back to government asking for subsidies to say, we've lost revenue, please provide us with a subsidy. But I think that there's the big element about talking about jobs and reskilling. For me, it becomes pretty difficult because I don't think we have a clear map as to what skills exactly are we going to need, how are we going to reskill the current workers, and how are we going to train the youth and future workers so that they are able to get meaningful jobs in future. So for me, I think it might be very important for us to say, first, let us do a skills map. What skills will be needed? You know, how critical are those skills? So that when we talk about reskilling, then we can begin to address specific skills. And when we provide training, we know that the training is fit for purpose. I think it would be a waste of our resources for us to train people who are going to be unemployed. It's better if we reskill and train people, and we know that there is a market for those skills and the people are going to get employed immediately. And I think I alluded to the issue of transparency. Everyone is talking about transparency, but we know right now that we might be talking about the 8.5 billion that is not there, but we are talking about a lot of other investments. I mean, the World Bank is going to finance the repurposing of commodity, but that information is not in the public domain. But I would want to agree with Richard. I saw Richard in some of the chats to say, maybe the fact that the 8.5 billion is not here is a blessing for South Africa, because we can look into our own internal finances and say, how do we use our own resources to finance a just transition? and how do we determine our own terms in terms of the just transition? Because we know that most of the time, all this foreign funding, all these foreign loans, they always come with conditionalities. And at the end of the day, those conditions become a burden to ordinary residents who, as we speak right now, are unemployed because our unemployment level is very high. So we think we need to say, how do we consolidate our own resources, and then we use those resources to finance a just transition. Then that way, as much as we understand the level of agency, but we can transition on our own way and deal with the issues in a South African way rather than following the conditions of the World Bank or the European Union. So for me, I think that's one of the most important aspects. And lastly, I think we need to allude to the fact that I think there's, as much as people are saying we're consulting, there's an element of injustice that is happening. Komati is already talking about projects, the PCC is talking about projects, the Mpumalanga Economic Green Cluster is talking about projects. But if you look into most of those projects, none of them are being informed by communities. We know that each and every community has its own dynamics. And it cannot be that we're all saying the projects will be focused on energy. People have alternative livelihood projects that they can come up with. The question is, do we have the resources or the finances to support community-owned projects that speak to day-to-day needs of the people? Even if it's about energy, can the people come up with their own ideas, and then we provide them with the relevant resources so that they begin to address their own household energy needs and they get the relevant support? Because currently, I think this whole discussion is not about making sure that people's well-being is taken care of. It's about how we reindustrialize South Africa, how we reindustrialize the energy sector. And judging by what we see happening, we know that workers know nothing around what's happening. We know that there's not enough information in the public domain that how many people will lose their livelihood when commodity closes, how many people will lose their jobs at a mine when commodity closes. Nothing of that nature is in the public domain. So I think it might be very important for us to understand that we're not only looking into the formal workers losing their jobs. The other question is, if commodity closes, it will affect the informal economy. There are people providing shelter, there are people selling food. What are we going to do with those people? So the whole process around we consult, when the informal sector does not have enough information, when workers do not have enough information about what's going to happen, then it becomes problematic because somebody somewhere is driving his or her own agenda at the expense of the community, and at the end of the day, they come back to us and say, we are consulting. So for me, it's very important that we adequately consult with people. Then out of the process, we can start developing plans. It's a skills map, make sure that the consultation is educational, we reach out to all other people, we bring local government in, then that way we will be dealing with the first important aspect of procedural justice. But right now, I don't see any justice, even though the framework insists that this must happen. And I think for me, if this doesn't happen, then everything that we are talking about in terms of JT is null and void. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks for staying with us despite the communication challenges. Kwezi, are you ready?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Afternoon, colleagues and comrades. My name is Ukwezi Mabasa, and I'm leading the economic and social policy work at FES, South Africa. And previously, I've worked for the trade unions and focused on several issues. And one of them has been this question around labor and livelihoods within the just transitions. So in my short presentation, I will make four key points. But just by way of introduction, I think at the heart of this discussion around jobs and skills in the just transition is a debate and a policy discourse around restructuring what we call the minerals and energy complex, which has been at the heart of South Africa's development for various centuries. And I think there is enough consensus in society that we need to restructure this minerals and energy complex. But the question is, what constitutes justice in this process of restructuring, especially when we consider the ongoing digital and low carbon economic transitions. So in other words, by way of introduction, what I'm trying to state as a first point of departure is that we cannot talk about jobs and skills outside of this question of economic restructuring. And this links to various areas of policy. And the first issue that I want to focus on, and Lebo has touched on this, is this issue around thinking about work, industrial relations, and collective bargaining in the just transition. Now, all the literature has illustrated that whenever there's structural change in the political economy, it has a direct effect on collective bargaining and industrial relations. And we've known through reading the evidence from several case studies that this normally creates some level of disruption and sometimes even conflict among stakeholders. The Marikana case study is one point, the South African Post Office is another one. But at the heart of this was this idea of the restructuring of work and what that means for collective bargaining and workers' rights. And I think this is important because the just transition, or the transition, sorry, to a low carbon economy raises serious questions around South Africa's industrial relations framework, right? And these questions are particularly centered on two important points. Is South Africa's industrial relations framework well suited for creating a just transition that protects workers' fundamental rights in the context of a low carbon economy? And will the emerging technologies intensify the protest and the conflicts about social redistribution in the country? And I think if we want to answer these questions, we have to use case study literature from emerging technologies to see how they've affected the nature of employment, but also industrial relations. And unfortunately, we don't have this evidence, even if one looks at the reports from on the RIPPP, we don't have this particular evidence on these emerging technologies. And it's an area of work that I think the PCC, but also the unions need to take up. We need to look at specific case studies and what has happened to the type of work that's created, but also how this affects industrial relations using these particular case studies. The second issue, and it's mentioned by the comrade who spoke before me, is that when we think about labor and livelihoods, we have to go beyond the formal markets and the traditional understanding of labor that reduces the labor question to basically work that is undertaken in industrial sites. And this is important because we know that informal work and entrepreneurial livelihood activities are significant contributors towards household income in the country and local economic development. And so when we speak about an inclusive labor market strategy in the context of the just transition, we have to consider informal labor. And there are several examples of informal workers who already contribute towards minimizing ecological degradation and supporting sustainable development in society. A case in point is the experience of waste pickers and reclaimers who operate on the margins of formal public waste management systems. We also need to consider informal workers in other sectors that have the potential to decrease emissions, such as public transport, i.e. informal taxi drivers. And this argument and this point around informal work and a wider conception of work is also important because it leads us to the question of gender in work. Because if we accept that we have to look beyond just the industrial side when we debate employment in the just transition, we then get to understand the other forms of work that are non-formal and unpaid that happen in communities and that are important for social reproduction, which is defined as the labor undertaken to reproduce human life and livelihoods in society. And it includes examples such as food preparation, child rearing, home care-based provision, community healthcare, and subsistence food production. So in other words, what I'm trying to highlight with this second point is that we need a wider conception of employment that takes us beyond just formal forms of work and what we understand as labor. And if we do that, it's inherently gendered, but also it's inherently more inclusive, and it addresses the question of the informal economy. The third point that I want to make around the debate on the jobs and just transition is that we have to also accept the difficult realities. And one of these is that there will be social cost and what we call externalities in the transition, particularly when we look at employment, but not only formal employment, but also informal employment and the livelihoods that surround the existing fossil fuel and minerals and energy driven complex economy that we have. And we have to think about adequate social protection measures to form a social buffer to carry these costs, these social costs of the transition, but also as a way of rethinking around different forms of labor and livelihoods in the future economy. And this is where I think the case for a universal basic income grant becomes an important social policy lever in managing the cost that will be produced by this structural transition. It provides a level of social protection for displaced workers and unemployed residents who experience a loss of income as a result of economic structural changes. And this social protection measure or intervention of the UBIC can be complemented by other labor market and broader economic skills programs that provide multiple livelihood pathways or options for workers and communities. A more radical view of this idea of the basic income grant as a social protection measure even argues that you can use it to change consumption patterns in the economy so that the expenditure is linked to low carbon economic activity. But secondly, it can decrease both workers and communities' reliance on wage employment, especially wage employment that produces adverse health and socioeconomic effects. The fourth and the last point that I want to make in this discussion on jobs and in the context of the transition is that I want to encourage us to move away from an energy-centric approach. I know that now we're focusing on energy because it is at the center of the minerals and energy complex. But I would suggest that we're not going to see the number of jobs and the quality of jobs that we want in the just transition if we just focus on just energy. So I would argue for an expansive multi-sector approach that goes beyond energy so that we can achieve the job outcomes and numbers that we want. But I also argue for this approach because I think that it's an approach that's more conducive than to thinking about value chains. Because the idea of jobs creation and also creating decent work is inherently tied to restructuring the value chains across different sectors. And I think it's more useful to think about it in this way. And if we think about this way, and this more expansive description that I've described, we must then accept that when we talk about the notion of jobs and the just transition, and we use a multi-sector approach, then we need to combine labor market intervention and social policy interventions, with changing the industrial trade, fiscal and policy competition policies that need to complement the just transition, the just transition in South Africa. And this is very important, especially if we look at issues such as localization and value chain approaches. So those are my brief 4 points. But the main one is that we need to rethink work, the idea of work. We need to look beyond just the formal ideas of work and livelihoods. And also we need to manage the cost. And I'm arguing that the easiest way to manage the cost is to expand social policy. And I'm advancing the UBIC as one way of doing it. Not in terms of just a social buffer, but an opportunity to change consumption patterns in the economy. Thanks.
Clear. Thanks, Chris. That's very clear. I want to open the floor again now for comments, questions to the inputs that we've received. Perhaps as I do recall that, Louis, you wanted to take the floor. I do not know if your point is still, you want to raise it now. But I saw in the chat, Sianda Siko asking a question to Lebu. Sianda Sikwa, you want to come in and direct your question? I do not see Sianda. Okay, I'm looking at hands. I see Jeffrey Fumulani Majuda. Jeffrey, can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. Thanks. I'm Jeffrey. I'm from Musina. Also a member of the Grassroots for Climate Action. My first question will go to the economists, as in our current maybe monetary and fiscal policies are they favorable enough when it comes to the matter of the just transition? Because I understand that I'm not an expert, but when there is more development coming in, it means there will be more financial demand. And when it comes to the issue of renewable energy, jobs in the just transition, I think at the moment it is not clear or what is it that we want as a country. I think we don't have a common grounds or common interests saying this is the vision for South Africa. Because for status, the PCC itself is not that it's not popular. Ordinary people don't know what is going on, this just transition that is coming, and it is civil society that is making more efforts for the people to know what is going on, and civil society is doing that with limited resources. But I think this is a great chance for South Africa to unite and say we are building a world-class economy. But we cannot do that if we are still depending on foreign investment and funding. We have to use whatever we have, come together. Even marginalized communities, we have got money, but it's only that if we trust each other, come together, I put my penny, you put yours, there will be something enough for us all. And yes, we have to transit, but focusing only on energy, it's something else. So I think we need a framework which will cover the whole economy, all the sectors, because the extractive industry is full of injustices. Every day we hear people crying in Marikana, in the coal belt, in KZN, in Newcastle, wherever. People are crying about this industry because it cannot be just, the transition cannot be just if we're still increasing our efforts in extracting mineral resources without coming with justice for animals and the entire natural world. You see, we have to talk about those things. What is it that we're going to do when we say we are transitioning? What about the environment itself? You know, because right now I think yes, we are crying about those abandoned mines, but still we are issuing more licenses each and every day, and we're also being abused by these new mines that we are licensing, you know, in this modern era where we are saying we are in a democratic country. And, you know, I think we actually need a reformed sort of governance and, you know, leadership. And, you know, there is a lot we have to talk about, not just the energy sector, because if we talk about the energy sector only, the transition won't be just, because we'll still have more and more atrocities coming to the people. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I see your comments, Yanda, that you are struggling to unmute. Perhaps what I can do is to invite Lebu to read your question and then respond to it. In the meantime, I note Zodwa, after Zodwa, Tulasizwe Zulu. Zodwa, you want to come back?
Okay, can I just come back? Chairperson. Okay, uzodwa la ngithi yazi angizasangana kahle okwi forum yabo mama ebizwa Women in Energy and Climate Change, and also G4CA ne from Soweto. The question that I asked before, uphendulile uMohammed, but angimzwanga kahle, to be honest. I think ngicela ukuthi ngibeke nje ngesintu so that mhlambe explain. I-question, yes, that i-question lebe ngiyibuzile in terms of mines rehabilitation. Ukuthi yes uphendulile, but kusho ukuthi lama funds azobe esetwa aside awama mines lanka already asebenzayo. And Majuda has also come up with saying kusebhizi kunikezana ngama license amatsha for ama areas ukuthi kuyo mine. So my question kakhulu was based on kuma mines la ashiwe emva angazange alungiswe ukuthi angazange rehabilitate. So ukuthi abanikazi bawo bahambile, they've got what they wanted and then they bahambile. So umbuzo wami bekuwukuthi lawo ma mines azokwenziwa kanjani, azo rehabilitatwa yi-government or municipality la ama mines ekhona, or they will try by all means ukuthi they must get back these people ababesebenzisa lama mines bethole yonke into abayifunayo kuyo na. We understand. So ukuthi at least ngibe clear on that issue here, singathethi nje sithi hayi emweni nje rehabilitation. Thank you.
I'll send the question to the guys at TIPS. I think Mohammed has left, but there are a few colleagues from TIPS that I will pass the question to. In the meantime, I see Sianda, is your hand still up?
Yes, thank you so much, Chair, and good afternoon, Lebu. I really wanted to ask about the readiness of our labor market institutions, particularly those that are discharged with the duty linked to collective bargaining. I think the discussions around just transition has been limited to practitioners that are working in the space, and perhaps some of the colleagues, either those that are representing employers or workers, may not be adequately capacitated around these contemporary trends, and we talk about these just transition principles. So I wanted to check whether is there some work that the PCC is doing around capacity building of these important labor market institutions so that they can adequately address issues linked to just transition if they find expression in their councils? Thanks.
Thanks, Yanda. Thanks for trying to join us. Before handing over to the panelists, I still want to take further questions. I'm going to invite Richard, but before you start, Richard, I want to translate what Zodwa was asking. Zodwa was asking the question of rehabilitation. Her question is, who is responsible for rehabilitation, for the rehabilitation of mines that are no longer operational? Whose responsibility is that? Is it government? And which layer of government is responsible for rehabilitation of mines that are no longer operational? So that is that is the question. If the colleagues that are remaining at TIPS are able to respond to that, that will be helpful. Or anyone else in the audience who can provide light on on that issue. Let's move on then to Richard. Then after Richard, it's going to be Tula Sizwe. Tula Sizwe, yes. Richard, please come. Can you hear me, Richard?
Sorry, it took me a while for the unmute to come up. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, it's as much a question as a comment as a question, and it relates to some of the questions in the question panel about the extent to which we can really get traction on employment and jobs as long as Treasury remains stuck in orthodox economics that doesn't seem to put real value on employment as such. You know, in the neoliberal mode, labor is a cost into production. And so as long as we're first and foremost trying to plan everything according to orthodox economics, opportunities for employment don't really receive the value that they have to society, and particularly in the South African context. And, you know, Louise in the chat mentioned the externalized costs of fossil fuel use. That's just one of the things that aren't brought into equations when we're looking at different pathways forward. But my question is mostly looking towards what's happening with our electricity national system at the moment, where it seems like there's now a resignation to full-scale liberalization of the entire system, such that tariffs and everything will be decided by markets. So, you know, we've got an Eskom master plan, but it doesn't talk about the extent of the role that markets will have in electricity. And recent developments, including what came through in the last PCC dialogue on energy in this series, suggests that now there's this commitment to wholesale marketization and the financialization that comes with it. Because if you're going to have a market in electricity, you've got to do a whole lot of financialization, because you don't actually have competitive delivery streams. You only have one grid. So a lot of financialization is required to create these markets. And within that context, it becomes very difficult to champion labor-intensive opportunities that in the short term might not fulfill the edicts of cost-reflective tariffs that World Bank impose in their loans. And I believe they've got that as a condition in some of the more recent loans as well. So, you know, is there some way that we can, in this discussion and the work of the PCC, start to push back against some of the really reductive implications of neoliberalism and orthodox economics, so that jobs don't get devalued into just this one of the costs of production, and are actually seen within a broader socioeconomic perspective? Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Tula Sizwe. Tula Sizwe. Can you hear me, Thulasizwe? It looks like Thulasizwe is not able to join. I'm looking at time. I just want to, before going back to the panelists to respond to some of the comments and questions, I want to ask Aradhna Panduram to respond to the question that Zodwa had asked. Aradhna, please, can you come in and explain what you wrote in the chat?
Hi, Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, the mining companies are supposed to allocate funds for rehabilitation, and they are supposed to prove that there's a guarantee of this funds and availability of this funds when they need to close. And I think the problem here is that they may have it initially, but they may probably use it during the mining operations and then end up with a situation where they may not have the funds available or not enough funds that were catered for initially and things like that.
Thanks, Aradhna. I hope, Zodwa, you did hear the response from Aradhna. Thulasizwe, are you able to join us? Thulasizwe Zulu. No. Let's go back to the panelists, Thomas, Kwezi, and Lebu. Let's start with Lebu. Any reflections on what you've heard, Lebu?
Yes, and this goes to Sia's point around what is the readiness of our labor market institutions. So different sectors are at different levels of readiness, and we'd probably place the mining resources council probably at the forefront of that readiness, and that's because of the energy transition issues that are big within that sector. And it's just to emphasize the fact that we need institutions, we need bodies that do the job of bringing employers and workers together to collaboratively or to collectively, in a bottom-up approach, create the solutions for the sectors. Firstly, to avoid the displacement of jobs, and secondly, to chart a way forward in terms of social and labor planning within particular sectors. So that's why we identify collective bargaining councils and other labor market institutions as being important, particularly for current jobs. I note the inefficiencies in terms of covering community participation, because collective bargaining is a process of those that are formally employed. That's why in my presentation, I talked about the need for an idea around global collective bargaining that covers people that are not necessarily within a particular agreement, and looking at how we sort of standardize the protection of workers across sectors, so that we're not stuck around the energy question only, but we have this multi-sectoral approach. There are labor market institutions that are working well in one sector and not necessarily in another sector. So this idea of also global collective bargaining could also assist us to cover the gaps in terms of sector participation between employer and employees, because I think the bottom-up approach is what labor market institutions are good at, and this is a model that we can replicate across various sectors. And this is the way in which we ensure that we truly don't leave, particularly from a worker point of view, don't leave workers behind. There are mechanisms, and Kwezi has covered them, on how we do this for workers as well as those that are in the informal sector. So I think those are my brief reflections, but definitely take the point that the PCC must champion this idea of making use of labor market institutions, particularly to answer the job displacement issue that we are confronted with in terms of the transition.
Yep. Thanks, Lebu. I'm going to go to Thomas and then to Kwezi. Then I'm going to ask Steve to close for us. Thomas and then Kwezi.
Thanks, Brian. But Brian, I think we need to acknowledge that for years, our economy was run on the basis that we need to grow our GDP. And once we achieve that, we will create jobs. But the reality of the situation is that it didn't happen. Actually, with the current economic system, instead of creating jobs, what we have done is the complete opposite. We have created high levels of inequality. And if we don't deal with that in terms of the just transition, then we will always live in a very highly unequal society. So for me, it's not only about the energy, it's about how we change our system from the one which focused on growing the economy to the one that promotes the welfare and the well-being of the people. So if you want equality, then we need to think about the welfare and the well-being of the people. So if we want to grow the economy, then it's not going to work. So in the current form, where we want to just reindustrialize the economy, one, what we're seeing that is happening right now is a concerted effort to try and privatize our energy system. And we know that if our energy system is in private hands, ordinary people are not going to have access to electricity or energy. We know there's already energy poverty in the country. People cannot afford it. So we need to stop that right from the onset. That's why we talk about a strong level of social ownership of our energy system. We need to stop from being consumers to being generators. We cannot always be viewed on the basis that we need to consume. So that's the first aspect. People always talk about having rehab funds, but we know that DMRE, in fact, just recently, the minister said we do not have enough funds for rehab. The issue is not about having enough funds or not. I think the issue is about why is DMRE failing to enforce the relevant laws, regulations. These companies are compelled in terms of their licenses to rehabilitate. Why do we have to run after them? And if they're failing, why does DMRE keep giving them another mining license? They failed in one area to fulfill their obligations. You still give them another mining right. Then you tell us that we don't have rehab funds. What are you doing? Why aren't you enforcing this? So if I steal, I'm sure by tomorrow, the cops will be right at my door to arrest me. Why can't we arrest the mines? Today we see cops running after Zamazamas. We don't see cops running after the big mining houses and say, these are the directors who oversee the process. They fail to rehabilitate, we need to arrest them. It's not happening. This is where we need to start to say, if we are all equal before the law, let us arrest those who break the law. And mining houses are one of those people who do that. So I think this is where we need to start. Land, if we want to promote equity, people want land to live. People want land for recreation. People want land to grow their own food. People want land for businesses. If we do rehabilitation, it's not just about rehabilitation. How do we ensure that workers and community people have access to that land so that they can take a decision as to how they use that land? And that doesn't mean when we rehabilitate and we engage communities and workers that we take away the obligation of the mine. They still have that legal obligation to oversee the process. So for me, I think that's the most critical aspect that we need to think about. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. Kwezi?
Yeah, no, thanks. Just three crucial points from my side to end off. One, on the question of our fiscal and monetary policy, both sets of policy frameworks are inadequate because they prioritize just managing debt and inflation over the other aspects that we need in the just transition, which is employment creation, an expensive social policy, and building an industrial base. So there will be no just transition if we're operating within the current fiscal and monetary policy frameworks. So colleagues of the PCC need to speak to their friends in Treasury. Two, are we ready in terms of labor markets and institutions? No, we're not. Why are we not ready? Because we need to widen our concept of labor. That's the first point, so that we account for different forms of work. The second point is that we don't have the evidence from the emerging technologies. We have numbers about measured in job years from the RIPPP program, and then pilot projects here and there, but we do not have the sufficient evidence that tells us what is the effect in terms of the nature of work, industrial relations, and the skills and other issues that people get when they engage in these in forms of employment in these projects. And I think this is the evidence that we need from the case studies I was speaking about. The third point is that it's quite clear that we can't see the whole debate around the just transition as an issue that's separate from the central point of restructuring South Africa's economy. And part of that is questioning the neoliberal framework that has driven our political economy for the past 25 years. And there are interesting debates around building a social economy, solidarity economy, and alternatives that are happening from different parts of the globe. And I think we need to draw those in. But the current framework will not get us to a just transition. We'll probably just produce a different iteration of a green racialized capitalism. Thanks.
Thanks, colleagues. I'm going to hand over to Steve, but before doing so, I just want to thank all of you for joining. We never have enough time for these conversations. It's been really engaging listening to you, and I keep learning every time I find time to join these sessions. I've noted, Steve, at least 22 distinct concepts this afternoon, at least 22. I'm not going to go through all of them, but this phenomenon of just transition is very broad, and you tried to narrow it to talk about jobs, but even that, it appears still needs further reframing so that we pull the conversation closer, not to agree, but to limit the space of the width of the conversation and increase the depth of the conversation. But this was very helpful to me, and I hope to all of us who are listening. Handing over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for that conclusion. You kind of took the words out of my mouth at the end here. I think that, I want to thank you, Brian, for the facilitation that went very smoothly and excellently. I also want to thank the various commissioners that attended this call. So I think we can be encouraged that this is something that commissioners are taking such an intense interest in. And of course, thanking the speakers for your contributions. Brian said it, very, very interesting and deep conversation. I think that this is kind of the forefront of the conversations that we need to have together now. We've been having extended conversations about what needs to be done and how much it will cost. But now we need to get into the depths and the methodology of how we need to transition and how that transition results in more equitable outcomes for the people of South Africa. And there were lots of ideas talked about here. I did want to touch on the one point that was raised several times around the inclusivity of stakeholder engagement and a more broad involvement of communities. And we at the PCC recognize that need, and we are planning on expanding our stakeholder engagement over time. We are working on translating many of our documents, particularly the Just Transition Framework, into all of the official languages so that they're more accessible. We're looking at building infographics and much more targeted, shorter pieces of communication that will help communities engage with the topics. And of course, we will be extending our actual face-to-face consultation. So I completely take Thomas's point that an online meeting is not the best forum for workers and communities, particularly those based in rural areas. So we will certainly be expanding our engagement. But I think the key point that came across many different inputs, both from the audience and from the speakers, is the just transition result requires a systems change. We have to think differently about how labor markets work, who's included in labor markets, who's not, how we are thinking about inclusivity, how we're thinking about labor and worker engagement, how we think about finance. To Richard's question, I wish I had a good answer for you. I think it's a great great question and something we need to continue the discussion on. Yeah, so how we finance, what we finance, what our goals are. Commissioner Bate gave a talk this week at Africa Oil Week, where she was talking about we have to think differently about how we measure financial success, and that for certain critical components of the economy and of investment, break even's probably okay. We should be thinking about breaking even and favoring other measures like job creation and so on. So a final wrap up. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to the speakers. Very rich conversation, but clearly just the beginning of what we need to do. So thanks very much and have a wonderful day. And we look forward to engaging again in the next conversation. Thanks, Brian.
Bye, everyone.